Thunder rolled like a verdict as Emily unfolded the letter and felt the room tilt. The ink named a betrayal she had never imagined, and her breath snagged in her throat. Her father's careful myths cracked, and memory spilled out like bright glass on concrete. She said, "Tell me this is a mistake," yet the words sat cold as coins in her palm. The apartment hummed with the old fridge and a louder rhythm stomping in her chest. She saw birthdays, lessons, and quiet nods, now stitched with threads of hidden rot. She whispered, "You built me on lies," and heat climbed her neck, shame chasing anger. The paper trembled as if alive, daring her to keep reading what she could not unlearn. A raw sound surged up, and she let it out, a jagged cry that rattled picture frames. In the ringing aftermath, she understood the ground had moved, and would not move back. The scream did not end so much as thin into the hum of night and traffic below. Emily stayed kneeling because standing felt like pretending this could be undone. She pressed her palm to the floor, cool and stubborn, and let anger balance grief. She said, "I believed you because I wanted to," and the admission tasted like rust. The lamp carved hard edges from the furniture, making the room a map of sharp corners. She counted her breaths, slow and unglamorous, until the world stopped shrinking. In her head, she replayed small kindnesses that now rang like rehearsed lines. A new thought arrived, quiet as rain on the sill, that truth can be built forward. She wiped her face, gathered the torn scraps, and felt the first stitch of resolve. Outside, a siren yawned and moved on, indifferent, and she chose not to follow it. Memory opened like a door she had closed without a latch, and never checked again. There was her father at the kitchen table, steady hands and wise sayings in easy loops. He told her truth was armor, and she wore it proudly, a child polished by praise. She said, "You taught me to fight," and heard the echo twist into something crooked. The stories now looked like scaffolding built to hide cracks no one was meant to see. She traced the edges of a photograph with her thumb and felt the paper resist. Grief flared, then cooled into a clearer heat that did not ask permission to burn. She whispered, "I survived because of you and despite you," and both were accurate. The kitchen in her mind faded, leaving the present lit by one stubborn lamp. She turned the letter fragments face down, as if the words could be unlearned by light. Emily stood, joints buzzing, and crossed to the window where the city kept breathing. She pressed her brow to the cold glass and watched taillights flow like red intentions. In the reflection, she saw a woman hollowed and bright, both ruined and beginning. She said, "You do not get to keep me," and the sentence steadied her spine. The blinds ticked softly, a metronome that refused to rush, and her lungs matched it. She did not forgive, not yet, but she refused to kneel to the old choreography. Every light below implied other lives, other rooms, other truths made by hand. A plan did not appear, but a direction did, rough as gravel and just as reliable. She lifted her chin and let the night air cool the heat stitched into her cheeks. The apartment felt less like a cell and more like a launch, ugly, cramped, ready. She sat by the window because endings deserve chairs and beginnings deserve posture. The scraps of paper waited in her lap like coals she could choose to carry or drop. She said, "I will name what hurt me and break its handles," and felt the room widen. Her pulse slowed into something workable, not calm, but honest and within reach. She pictured tomorrow like a narrow bridge and decided to cross it step by step. The past would tug, but she would tie it to facts, not fantasies polished by fear. She folded one fragment carefully, a ritual for leaving, not keeping what it held. The city thinned toward midnight, and she matched it, lighter by something invisible. She whispered, "I am not finished," and the words arrived without flinching. The quiet returned, not an enemy now, but a witness who would stay while she rose. Morning arrived like a truce rather than a gift, and the city exhaled steam. Emily brewed coffee and counted the small clicks that made order from noise. The letter scraps stayed in a drawer, shut but not silenced by wood. She tied her hair and faced the mirror that remembered everything. Emily said, "Do the next thing," and the sentence felt workable. The bus stop gathered strangers with damp coats and private storms. She watched tailpipes bloom and thought about work that forgot her name. The ache was present but not in charge, like weather in a closed room. She rehearsed the tasks and the exits and the pauses between both. Emily said, "Hold the line," and the mug warmed her fingers into focus. She locked the door and treated the hallway as a starting lane. The day would not bend for her, but she could measure it and move. The office woke like a machine shaking off dust, and screens blinked into duty. Emily slid into her chair and greeted the inbox that never slept. She mapped priorities and left space for the mess that would arrive late. The chatter around her moved in loops that left her outside the circle. A manager waved past, and the numbers demanded their quiet arithmetic. Emily said, one task at a time, and the knot in her chest loosened. She answered a complaint with patience that cost a private hour. Colleagues stacked requests without malice, only habit and speed. She fixed what was broken and documented what would break again. The room smelled of toner and coffee and small ambition. Emily said, "I am here, and I am capable," and meant it. The clock advanced without ceremony, and she matched it minute for minute. At lunch, she stepped outside where traffic stitched a steady seam down the block. The call connected, and her mother's voice arrived wrapped in careful questions. Emily kept answers small because large ones woke old ghosts fast. Her mother offered a recipe and a prayer and never asked for truth. Emily said, "I'm managing," and felt the words sit crooked in her mouth. She watched pigeons bargain with crumbs and thought about the cost of peace. The past insisted like a song played 2 floors down, always audible. She chose not to turn it off and not to sing along either. Stoic habits asked for focus on what was hers to shape. Emily said, "I will keep my side clean," and the wind accepted it. She ended the call with thanks that were true and unfinished. The hour closed, and she returned to the door that kept her fed. Back at her desk, the printer jammed, and a queue howled in silent metrics. Ethan Cole leaned on the divider with a look that cut polite angles. He was the colleague who spoke like salt, simple and stinging when needed. Ethan said, "You hide when things matter and set the page stack straight." Emily felt heat climb and made herself not retreat into jokes. Ethan said, "You have the work, so claim the room or watch it pass." The words landed heavy, but left a clear outline to color. She wanted to argue and found only air where excuses live. Emily said, "I am done asking for permission to exist." Ethan nodded once, which was the whole speech he would give today. The printer cleared, and the numbers resumed their bleached parade. Something unclenched, small and real, like a door that finally fit its frame. Evening settled with a quieter temperature, and the lobby smelled like wet stone. Emily paused by the bulletin board, where notices made soft promises. A night course offered skills her job used without giving credit. Emily said, "Take one step," and pulled her phone to enroll. The price stung, but the old cage cost more and paid nothing back. She pictured a future that did not require whispering to be safe. The bus window turned the city into streaks that looked like momentum. She drafted a message to herself with 3 plain commitments for tomorrow. Emily said, "Show up, speak once, deliver calm," and saved it. The fig stayed, but it rode behind a steadier driver now. She watched her reflection prioritize posture over apology. The day closed its ledger, and she could live with the math it made. The storm came at work, disguised as routine. A client email accused her team of negligence, but Emily saw her name singled out. The words struck like stones, their weight heavier because no one defended her. She said, "This isn't the truth," but her voice sank into the office hum. Screens glowed cold, and whispers rippled like static, leaving her in a spotlight she did not choose. She remembered her father's hidden lies and felt betrayal hum in her blood again. Her pulse hammered as she typed a reply, fingers stiff, choosing restraint over fire. Ethan passed her desk and muttered, "Don't let them pin it," and left. Emily inhaled, steadying herself against the shame trying to spread. She whispered, "Not this time," and sent the response like an arrow through fog. The silence that followed was thick, but for once she did not shrink inside it. The afternoon dragged like wet rope, and then came the blow. In a meeting room lined with glass, her supervisor recited complaints as if they were gospel. Emily sat straight, though her hands pressed tight in her lap. She said, "I did the work," but the words met a polite smile and an agenda already written. Notes scratched on paper as though her defense was air. Shame prickled her neck, but anger burned stronger, refusing to collapse. She remembered Ethan's warning, "They will pin it if you let them." Her voice steadied, and she added, "Check the records. They speak louder than rumor." A hush followed, awkward and sharp, but she didn't bend. She left the room marked as difficult, but not defeated. The sting stayed, yet beneath it ran a current of pride. For the first time in years, she did not swallow her own defense. By evening, the ache in her chest lingered, but doubt pressed harder than fatigue. Alone at her desk, Emily stared at unfinished files, haunted by the echo of accusations. She muttered, "Maybe I am not enough," and the words stung worse for being familiar. The hum of the printer mocked her with steady competence. She saw shadows of her past self, quiet, compliant, overlooked, threatening to reclaim her. Her shoulders slumped, but she forced her eyes back to the screen. She recalled the torn letter, the scream that had split her silence, and the vow not to remain invisible. Ethan's blunt voice replayed, "You hide when it matters." Emily whispered, "Then I will not hide," letting the syllables steady her breathing. She returned to the file, hands sure despite their tremor. A small light flickered inside. The work was hers, and so was her claim to it. Ethan found her still there when others had fled into evening. He leaned on the desk and smirked without warmth. Ethan said, "You're stronger when cornered, but you wait too long to fight." Emily closed her laptop and looked at him directly. She replied, "I am not hiding anymore," and the words were heavier than she expected. He nodded once, eyes sharp but almost approving. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest. He said, "Then prove it when the room is full, not when it's empty." The challenge pressed against her ribs, but it sparked something deeper. Emily's jaw set as she said, "Next time, I will." Ethan's smirk softened into something close to respect, and he walked away. She sat in the quiet, feeling both called out and called forward. The night outside was wide, and she finally felt awake inside it. Walking home beneath sodium lamps, Emily replayed the day like bruises pressed. The city roared and sighed, and she let the noise braid with her thoughts. She carried no victory, but she carried something harder to erase, a refusal to vanish. She whispered, "I will not shrink," and the wind stole it but left its weight inside. The betrayal of her father had been a lesson in silence. This was a lesson in voice. She saw shop fronts closing, workers trailing bags, strangers pushing against weather. Each face looked tired, but each kept moving, and she matched them step for step. Her chest still ached, but her spine felt taller, and she noticed the difference. The street was ordinary, but tonight it felt like proof that survival had a rhythm. Emily said tomorrow, "I will not wait to fight," and this time she believed it. The next morning, the air in the office carried tension like static before lightning. Emily entered the conference hall where her supervisor waited with folded arms. Documents on the table painted her as careless, yet she knew the truth lived elsewhere. Her pulse rattled, but she squared her shoulders and refused to shrink. He said, "This is unacceptable," and his voice cut through the stale air. Emily replied, "I followed the protocol, and the logs confirm it," her voice steadier than she felt. Every eye in the room searched her for weakness, but she locked her gaze on the facts. Betrayal threatened to pull her under, but she had rehearsed this storm. She said, "Blame won't fix what data already proves," and silence thudded across the space. Her hands trembled under the table, but her spine stayed upright. For the first time, she saw him falter before replying. That night, Emily visited her mother's home, where the quiet smelled of old rugs and simmering broth. Her mother glanced up from the stove, her eyes asking questions her mouth did not. Emily sat at the table, trying to swallow words that tasted bitter. She said, "He lied to us both," and the silence cracked open between them. Her mother's face twisted, torn between anger and denial. She whispered, "We survived by believing," and her voice was paper-thin. Emily clenched her jaw, tears threatening, but she refused to fold inward again. She said, "I cannot keep carrying his shadow, and neither should you." The kitchen hummed with the slow simmer, refusing to take sides. Her mother turned away, shoulders stiff, and the distance cut deeper than any insult. Emily knew the truth was a weapon and a wound, and tonight it was both. Alone in her apartment later, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by torn drafts. The rejection of her mother stung sharper than her supervisor's accusations. She said, "Even now, I'm still asking to be believed," and the admission tasted sour. The night pressed against her windows, and the room carried the smell of paper and ink. She had built her life on silence and survival, and it had left her fragile. The walls felt narrow, but the air inside her chest expanded with defiance. Emily muttered, "I will not ask again," and her voice carried further than she expected. Tears ran hot but steadied her, each drop a mark of release. Her shadow stretched long against the wall, more solid than she fell. She breathed slow, the rhythm rough, and held herself upright, not as a daughter or an employee, but as someone unbroken. The next day, Ethan cornered her in the break room, where the hum of machines filled the silence. He said, "You looked him in the eye." That was new. Emily stirred her coffee, letting the bitter scent steady her. She replied, "I was tired of shrinking," and the words sounded like truth. Ethan smirked, but it was less cruel this time, more like approval disguised. He said, "Don't waste it. The next storm will be worse." Emily looked at him and said, "Then I'll be ready." The moment was raw, not friendship but something sharp that pushed her forward. The coffee tasted burned, but it marked the beginning of her own momentum. Ethan's silence after was as meaningful as any speech. She carried the weight of his words not as burden but as armor. The storm loomed larger, but for once she was not afraid to meet it. That evening, Emily returned home and stood by the window where the city pulsed below. The shadows of betrayal, rejection, and doubt pressed close, but her breath carried differently now. She whispered, "This is not the end of me," and the words grounded her. Her reflection showed eyes rimmed with fatigue, but lined with something fiercer. She remembered Ethan's warning, her mother's silence, and her father's lies, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they shaped the edge of her resolve. She pressed her palm flat to the glass, feeling the cool surface steady her. She said, "I will not vanish, and I will not bend," the sound low but resolute. The city lights flared brighter, as if answering her defiance. For the first time, the quiet did not feel like a cage, but a canvas waiting. She allowed herself to stand tall in its frame. The office buzzed with its usual rhythm when Emily overheard the words that froze her. A hushed conversation near the copier revealed a buried truth. Her father's scandal was known by the company long before she joined. Her chest tightened as betrayal sharpened into clarity. She said, "They all knew," her whisper trembling between rage and disbelief. The revelation cracked her history wide open. Silence had been orchestrated, not accidental. The memory of his teachings echoed, hollow and cruel. Ethan's warning rang louder now, a reminder to stop running. She clenched her fists beneath the desk, the sting grounding her. The truth was no longer just personal. It had poisoned the soil of her workplace too. Emily whispered, "This is where I stopped being quiet," and felt the weight of the past roll forward. The secret once buried had forced itself into the light. The truth spread inside her like fire chasing dry wood. Emily stepped into the break room, heart pounding, and faced Ethan. She said, "They've known about him all along," and the words tasted like metal. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, but he did not feign surprise. He replied, "Secrets always leak. The question is what you'll do when they do." Emily swallowed hard, fighting the tremor in her hands. Her past and present blurred into one battlefield, and retreat was no longer possible. She said, "Then I'll fight with what I have," though doubt pulled at her ribs. Ethan gave her a look, part warning, part reluctant respect. The hum of the vending machine filled the pause like static. Emily felt the shift. Silence had been her armor once, but now truth was her weapon. For the first time, she saw herself holding it. Later that night, Emily sat on her bed with the letter fragment spread before her like evidence. The revelation twisted everything she thought she had escaped. She whispered, the lies weren't just his, they were theirs too. Her voice cracked, but the truth no longer crushed. It clarified. Tears slipped silently, but her hands moved with certainty, taping the fragments back together. It wasn't to preserve the lie but to own it, to strip it of power. Each piece became less of a wound and more of a scar to be carried openly. She said, "You cannot erase me," her words directed at shadows stretching across the walls. The weight of silence was gone. This was her reckoning. Her chest rose, steadier now, as if the air itself agreed. For the first time, she felt her past was not a chain, but a broken lock. The next day, confrontation arrived without warning. Her supervisor cornered her with accusations, this time heavier and sharper. He said, "Your past makes you a liability," and the words cut through the room. Emily's face burned, but her voice rose steadier than ever. She replied, "My past is not my fault, but my strength is mine." Gasps spread among the team, the silence electric with shock. He faltered, but pressed on with threats veiled as warnings. Emily stood taller, heart pounding like war drums inside her chest. She said, "I will not carry his sins, and I will not bow to yours." The weight in her throat lifted with each word spoken aloud. Ethan lingered at the doorway, silent witness, his eyes unreadable. For the first time, Emily's voice filled the room completely, and it did not tremble. That evening, Emily stood on a rooftop, overlooking the city, wind pulling at her hair. She whispered, "The truth belongs to me now." Her words carried into the night. The skyline glowed like a field of sparks, each light proof that survival could blaze into life. She thought of her father, her mother's silence, Ethan's challenges, and her supervisor's threats. They no longer pressed her down, they sharpened her edges. She breathed deep, chest steady, and said, "I choose who I become." The words hung in the wind, not fragile but anchored. For years she had lived in shadows, built cages from doubt and lies. Now, she stood above it all, the city stretching wide and open. The betrayal that once shattered her had instead carved her strength. She turned toward the stairwell with a new fire, carrying her vow into tomorrow. The boardroom carried the weight of judgment, its walls of glass turning into mirrors that trapped her reflection. Emily stood at the end of the long table, facing executives who had already decided her fate. Her supervisor said, "You are compromised," his voice sharp, but it trembled at the edges. Emily steadied her voice and replied, "I am not compromised. I am clear." The silence thickened, heavy with disbelief and curiosity. She unrolled documents, laying out proof of her work, her precision undeniable. Each page slammed down like a drumbeat, her defense written in ink no rumor could erase. "I will not inherit shame that was never mine," she declared, eyes locked on every face in the room. The hum of the air conditioning filled the pause after her words, and no one interrupted. In the stillness, she knew she had cut through their narrative. The confrontation escalated. Her supervisor leaned forward, desperate to claw back authority. He said, "Your name is stained," each word meant to cut, but they only sharpened her will. Emily inhaled slowly, her chest rising with unflinching rhythm. She replied, "My name is my own, and I will defend it without apology." A flicker of defiance passed across his face, the kind that hides fear poorly. Around the table, murmurs rose like wind before a storm. Emily pressed on, showing evidence of his own missteps, exposing cracks in his authority. "Accountability is not a weapon," she said. "It is the truth we owe each other." Gasps circled the room, some faces shocked, others almost relieved. Her hands trembled beneath the surface, but her voice did not falter. For the first time the power shifted, not to him, but to her. The pressure cracked something inside her, and doubt stormed in uninvited. Alone in the restroom minutes later, Emily gripped the sink and stared into her reflection. Her breath came shallow, her hands trembling, the weight of her choices pressing heavy. She whispered, "What if they're right?" And the question hollowed her chest. Her reflection looked like both stranger and warrior, fragile but unyielding. She shut her eyes and recalled the rooftop vow. "I choose who I become." Tears burned at the edges but refused to fall. She clenched her fists until blood warmed her fingers again. Her heart pounded like a drum she could not ignore. She whispered, "Not this time. I'm not breaking here," and the words steadied her legs. When she opened her eyes again, the reflection was the same, but her gaze was unshaken. Returning to the boardroom, Emily carried herself like steel forged in fire. Ethan stood quietly near the back, watching his silence a steady anchor. She lifted her chin, her voice calm but cutting. "The truth does not vanish because you ignore it," she said, her words carrying through the hall. The supervisor tried again, but his voice cracked, each defense weaker than before. Emily placed her final piece of evidence on the table, his signature on a document proving he had concealed the scandal. Gasps echoed, louder this time, like thunder rolling across the room. She said, "This is where accountability begins," and her words struck with precision. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was full of collapse. Ethan nodded once, a rare gesture of acknowledgement. Emily exhaled, her shoulders easing, victory flickering at the edges of exhaustion. The climax broke not with shouting, but with silence. The executives rose, some in shock, others in quiet approval, while the supervisor sat hollow in his chair. Emily stood steady, heart thundering but chest lifted high. She whispered, "I will not carry your lies," and the words sealed the air. The city lights outside flickered on, casting long shadows across the glass walls. For the first time, she felt her father's ghost slip from her shoulders. Ethan caught her eye and gave a nod, sharp and brief, like the closing of a chapter. Emily gathered her documents, each page proof that truth could not be buried forever. She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing like drums of triumph. The room did not applaud, but it no longer caged her. She had faced the fire, and she had not been consumed. The dust of confrontation settled, leaving Emily walking home in the cool hush of night. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but her chest lifted with something steadier than victory, clarity. She whispered, "The fight is over, but the work begins," her breath carrying into the crisp air. The city lights shimmered against puddles, small mirrors reflecting her steps. For years she had lived beneath a weight, not hers to carry. Now the silence felt different, no longer suffocating but open, expansive. She thought of her father and the cracks his lies left in her, and she no longer flinched. She said, "You shaped me, but you do not own me," and the words untied a final knot inside her. Each step felt like reclamation, her body weary yet unbowed. Tonight was not an ending. It was the start of living without shadows dictating her every move. At her mother's kitchen, silence stretched like an ocean. The air smelled faintly of herbs and dust, familiar but heavy. Emily placed the taped letter on the table, its cracks now mended but visible. Her mother turned, eyes rimmed with fatigue, and asked nothing. Emily said, "He lied to us both, but I am done hiding," her voice quiet but unwavering. Her mother's lips pressed thin, her hands tightening on the counter. For a moment, Emily feared rejection again, the old silence returning to bury her. Then her mother sighed, eyes moist, whispering, "Maybe it's time I stop pretending too." The words, fragile but real, loosened something that had been locked for years. Emily reached across the table, fingers brushing her mother's hand. For once, the silence that followed was not an enemy, but a fragile bridge waiting to hold. Back at the office days later, Emily felt the shift as soon as she walked in. The whispers had dulled, replaced with sidelong glances of curiosity and respect. She carried her bag with quiet dignity, no longer weighed down by fear. Ethan caught her eye across the room, leaning against his desk with folded arms. He didn't speak, but the smallest nod passed between them. She said softly to herself, "Respect is not given, it is earned in fire." The hum of machines and chatter no longer drowned her out. They became background to her presence. She took her seat, opened her files, and began again. The work hadn't changed, but she had. The chair that once felt like a cage now felt like a platform. For the first time, she didn't have to shrink to fit in. She simply existed, and that was enough. Weeks later, Emily stood before a small classroom at night, chalk dust rising in the dim light. She had enrolled in the evening course she once hesitated to join, and now she spoke from the front rather than hiding in the back. Her voice carried steady, teaching skills she once felt unworthy of sharing. She said, "Strength isn't born from never breaking, it's born from refusing to stay broken." Students scribbled notes, their eyes lit with curiosity and recognition. She felt a tremor of disbelief at first, but it quickly gave way to pride. Every sentence was a declaration of her survival, reshaped into guidance for others. The ghosts of her past hovered still, but they no longer silenced her. Emily stood tall, her presence commanding without shouting. In that classroom, she was not invisible, she was undeniable. The final night found Emily on her rooftop again, city lights sprawling like constellations at her feet. She leaned against the railing, the wind teasing her hair. Her voice was steady as she whispered, "I am not the shadow of lies, I am the proof of change." The words echoed, not loud but powerful, absorbed by the night sky. She closed her eyes, letting the air press cool against her face. The scars of betrayal, silence, and doubt were still there, but they no longer ruled her. She carried them as marks of survival, reminders of her strength. Opening her eyes, she smiled, not wide, but quiet, certain. The skyline flickered with life, and she felt part of it, no longer apart from it. Emily turned and walked toward the stairwell, the sound of her steps steady, final, and full of beginning.